Okay, so you want to own a nuclear power plant, a machine that turns uranium into electricity, runs 24 hours a day for 60 years, and sells every single watt to a grid that has nowhere else to go. No competitor is opening next door. No customer is choosing someone else at 3 a.m. when the temperature drops. That's the pitch. Guaranteed demand, a captive market, and a fuel that produces more energy per pound than anything else on Earth. That is the dream, and it is not entirely wrong. Here's what it doesn't tell you. The bill arrives years before the electricity does, and by the time you're generating a single dollar, you may have already spent more than the plant is worth. Let's start with what it costs to build one, because this is where nuclear breaks every rule of normal construction math. According to World Nuclear Association data and 2025 EIA estimates, overnight capital costs for new U.S. nuclear now run around $7,800 to $15,000 per kilowatt. A standard 1,100 megawatt reactor sits at $8 to $17 billion in overnight cost alone. That's before interest. The two newest American reactors, Vogtle Units 3 and 4 in Georgia, were originally budgeted at $14 billion in 2009. When they finally came online in 2023 and 2024, the total deal was $35 billion, 7 years late. That's $15.7 million per megawatt, the single most expensive energy project in U.S. history. And Vogtle isn't the outlier. 2 South Carolina reactors were canceled entirely after costs rose from $9.8 billion to $25 billion, with nothing to show for it. A Washington state project in the 1980s saw costs balloon from $4.1 billion to over $24 billion before it was scrapped, triggering a $2 billion bond default. Researchers who reviewed 75 nuclear projects for the Congressional Budget Office found average cost overruns of 207%. A separate 2014 global study of 180 reactors found average overruns of 117%. This isn't bad luck striking 1 or 2 projects. It's the default outcome of the industry. Before you pour concrete, you need permission, and this is its own multi-year, multi-hundred million dollar project. In the U.S., the Nuclear Regulatory Commission requires a 2-step license, a construction permit, and a separate operating license, each demanding exhaustive documentation on everything from seismic risk to cybersecurity to evacuation planning. Licensing and permitting alone can take a decade before a shovel touches ground. Add site studies, environmental review, and public hearings, and you can spend hundreds of millions of dollars before you're legally allowed to start. Now, the trap that kills more nuclear projects than any engineering failure: interest during construction. When you borrow billions to build a plant that takes 7, 10, sometimes 20 years to finish, you are paying interest on that debt every single day construction drags on, with zero electricity being sold to offset it. A 5-year delay on an $8 billion loan at typical rates can add billions more before a single watt reaches the grid. This is exactly what happened at Vogtle, and it's why nuclear plants routinely defy the normal rule of infrastructure. The longer construction takes, the more expensive the plant gets, compounding on itself. Once you're finally operating, the cost structure flips completely. Running a nuclear plant is remarkably cheap compared to building one. Fuel costs are famously low, roughly 0.6 to 0.7 cents per kilowatt hour, since uranium is so energy dense that a 1,400 megawatt plant might spend only around $70 million a year on fuel. Operations and maintenance, meaning staff, inspections, and repairs, run another $200 to $220 million annually for a plant that size. A large plant employs close to 1,000 people, from reactor operators to security personnel to health physics technicians, at an annual payroll that can exceed $140 million. Add mandatory decommissioning reserves, because every plant must set aside money throughout its operating life to pay for eventual dismantlement, typically $500 million to over $1 billion set aside over decades. Add liability insurance, which in the U.S. is capped and pooled under the Price-Anderson Act, specifically because no private insurer would otherwise touch the risk. All in, a 1.4 gigawatt plant might spend around $290 million a year to operate, against a construction bill that could be 10 to 30 times that amount. Here's where the revenue actually comes from. A nuclear plant sells electricity into the grid at wholesale rates. And unlike a peaker gas plant that only runs when demand spikes, a nuclear reactor runs at close to 90 to 95% capacity nearly all year, because once it's built, the marginal cost of generating one more megawatt hour is tiny. Running that hard and that consistently is the entire financial logic. Every additional hour online is nearly pure margin against your fuel and operating costs. On top of straight electricity sales, many plants collect additional layers of revenue governments have built specifically to keep nuclear alive. In New York, the state paid existing reactors a zero-emission credit of over $17 per megawatt hour just to keep them from shutting down early, because officials calculated that losing the plants would spike regional carbon emissions by over 31 million metric tons. Federally, the 2022 Inflation Reduction Act introduced production tax credits worth up to 1.5 cents per kilowatt hour for existing plants, credits that survived the 2025 One Big Beautiful Bill Act, even as renewable subsidies were cut back. In other words, nuclear plants increasingly get paid not just for the electricity, but for existing. Now the disaster case study. And it's not a meltdown, it's a balance sheet. In the 1980s, Washington State's public power supply system tried to build 5 reactors simultaneously to meet projected demand growth that never materialized. Costs spiraled from an estimated $4.1 billion to more than $24 billion. 2 of the 5 plants were canceled before completion. 1 was mothballed indefinitely, and the utility defaulted on $2.25 billion in municipal bonds, the largest municipal bond default in U.S. history at the time. Investors who had been told they were buying into guaranteed, government-backed infrastructure lost nearly everything. The plants weren't unsafe. They weren't mismanaged in any single dramatic way. They simply took too long, cost too much, and the demand they were built for shrank while they were still under construction. That's the structural risk sitting underneath every reactor. You are committing 10 to 20 years and tens of billions of dollars against a demand forecast that has to hold steady that entire time, in an industry where nearly every project runs over budget and over schedule. Let's run the numbers on 2 scenarios. Optimistic case, you build a standardized 1.4 gigawatt AP1000 style reactor with no major delays, using an experienced contractor and a design that's already been proven once. Overnight cost, around $4 billion. Financing during a clean 5-year construction window brings total capital cost to roughly $4.6 billion. Operating at 90% capacity factor, the plant generates about 11 billion kilowatt hours a year. Sold even at a modest wholesale price of 4 cents per kilowatt hour, that's $440 million in annual revenue, against roughly $290 million in operating costs, leaving $150 million a year before debt service. Paid down over 40 to 60 years, that plant is a genuinely durable, profitable asset, which is exactly why Georgia Power's public defenders of Vogtle still project modest long-term returns despite the overruns. Realistic case? The same reactor design, but regulatory changes mid-construction force redesigns. The workforce is inexperienced with the specific reactor type, and the project runs 7 years past schedule, matching Vogtle's actual experience. Overnight cost of $4 billion becomes an all-in cost of $17 billion or more once interest during construction and rework are included. That same $150 million in annual operating margin now has to service debt on a plant that cost nearly 4 times more to build, stretching the payback period from a couple of decades into a lifetime, and turning a genuinely profitable asset into one that barely breaks even, if it ever does. So if you decide to own a nuclear power plant, understand what you're actually buying.
You're not buying a power station. You're buying a 60-year bet that a 10 to 20-year construction project will not run over budget, that regulations won't shift beneath you mid-build, that demand will still be there when you finally switch it on, and that a fuel producing more energy per pound than anything else on the planet is worth the wait.
In the right country, with the right regulator, and a design built more than once before, it can be one of the most durable, high-margin assets in the entire energy industry. The question is whether you can survive the decade it takes to find out.